Nature isn't just out there in some far-off exotic location. It's all around us, including right outside our doors. Hi, my name is Shannon Trimboli, and I am the host of Backyard Ecology. I invite you to join us as we ignite our curiosity and natural wonder, explore our yards and communities, and improve our local pollinator and wildlife habitat. Hi, everyone. Today we're talking to Dr. Jeff Skevington and Michelle Locke. Jeff and Michelle are co-authors of the book, Field Guide to the Flower Flies of Northeastern North America. Hi, Michelle and Jeff. Welcome to Backyard Ecology. Thank you for talking with us today.
Hi there.
Thanks for having us.
Hey, yeah. I'm really looking forward to this conversation because flower flies are such amazing mimics that oftentimes people don't even know they're looking at them. I mean, I've seen so many pictures on social media and books, newsletters, all kinds of different places of so-called bees, and they're not bees at all. They're actually flower flies. So I think this is going to be an exciting episode that's very enlightening and educational for many of our listeners. But before we get started talking about the flower flies themselves, let's begin by just telling everybody a little bit about who each of you are and what you do.
Sure. So my name is Michelle Locke. I work for the Canadian National Collection of Insects, Arachnids, and Nematodes in Ottawa, Ontario. I got started on flower flies when I came to Ottawa to do my master's with Jeff on a group of flower flies called Daisy Surface, and they're smaller surfines. And I sort of fell in love with the group. I didn't know all that much about them before, but I had done my university undergrad at Guelph and taken several insect courses and really liked insects. So when I wanted to pursue a graduate degree, this seemed like a really great project. Now I work as a collections technician at the insect collection. So I'm here permanent full-time now.
Nice. Jeff?
Yeah, so I also work at the Canadian National Collection of Insects. You might hear us call it CNC. We get used to abbreviating it. It's one of the really big insect collections in the world. The others people have probably heard of, like the British Museum of Natural History or the Smithsonian Institutions Collection, American Museum. So we're amongst the big collections of the world, even though we're fairly young compared to some of them, like the collection in London or Paris. I've been here since, I guess, 2004. Before that, I worked in Sacramento at the California Department of Food and Agriculture for a little over a year. And I did my PhD in Australia in Brisbane, and my master's at University of Guelph, where Michelle did her undergrad. I did my undergrad and master's there with Steve Marshall, and he'd be a great guest for you sometime. He's done some fantastic books on flies and beetles and different groups of insects. Yeah, so anyways, it's a lot of fun working in the collection, and we have over 17 million specimens at our disposal, and can play with those and look at those. I've been interested in insects since I was a little kid, and got into birding and other aspects of natural history as well. So I'm just a natural history geek. And so I did my PhD on big-headed flies and started dabbling with flower flies at that point. So you'll also hear us call them hover flies. In fact, many of your listeners might know them as hover flies. Both names are typical common names. They both apply. They're both very descriptive. They're excellent at hovering. They're fantastic pollinators, and most of them go to flowers. So they're both apt names.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you brought up the fact that many people call them hover flies instead of flower flies, because that's what I always called them too until relatively recently. And then I've started calling them flower flies more often than hover flies nowadays, just because I've started to realize that they really are important pollinators and they do play an important role. And I don't know, I've started calling flower flies almost as much as a PR for the flies, because flies aren't exactly the most charismatic organism out there. Many people kind of turn their noses up when you say a fly. When I talk about pollinators and pollinator gardens and stuff and bring up flies as being good pollinators, I always laugh and make the comment usually that we talk about pollinators, we're thinking bees and butterflies. And nobody ever comes to me and says, hey, Shannon, I want to create a fly garden, even though flies can be important pollinators. So I've started calling them more flower flies just to give them that extra charisma, maybe because flower is a more charismatic word than hoverfly. But like you said, I've always called them hoverflies before, and I still do sometimes. I go back and forth on the two names. But are there any other names that we should be familiar with that they might be called?
No, those are the main two names. I mean, the family is Syrphidae, the Latin name, and so you'll also hear us call them Syrphids sometimes for short. But it was our colleague and mentor Chris Thompson who coined the term flower flies, and he did it for the very reasons you're describing. It's a much better indicator of their role in the environment. There was a nice paper by Romina Rader in 2016 where she summarized all that we know about pollinators and agricultural ecosystems, and she summarized the numbers based on all the papers that she could put together. And 39% of pollination is done by non-bees, 38% done by honeybees, which are introduced, and 22% is done by native bees. So a lot more is done by non-native bees. And in fact, most of those are flies. So flies are really important pollinators. Of course, flower flies are not the only group of pollinating flies. There are many, many. A huge group are called tachinids. We work with a couple people who study tachinid flies. They're also called bristle flies. And some of them look just like house flies, but they're a little bit more bristly. But they have a very different lifestyle. They're all parasitoids. The larvae live in other insects, so they lay their eggs. Well, they get their larvae into other insects in fascinating and varied ways. Some of them lay tiny eggs that herbivorous insects actually feed on as they're feeding. They ingest the eggs and then it develops inside them. Others directly deposit their eggs in or on the host. And so and it's an incredibly diverse group with 10,000 described species and many, many more, maybe 100,000 species in the world. And almost all the adults are pollinators. So flower flies are not the only group of pollinator flies. There are others. But we like to think of flower flies as the butterflies of the fly world. They're the charismatic sister to the rest of the flies.
Yes. And I'll have to look into tachinid flies more. And that might be another post for the future, because I think they get a bad rep a lot of times because of some of that parasitoid life history. So yeah, that's interesting. I'll have to look into them more. But on the flower fly, so that we don't get everybody confused to the Syrphids and talking about those, how many different species do we have in Eastern North America?
So our field guide covers all of Northeastern North America, and it covers 413 species. So in the book, there was a few new species that we put in the book without names, and we later described them and gave most of them names in a paper. But I'm sure that there's still more that we haven't uncovered yet, and that we will still continue. And in the West, the fauna is much less known, and there's still many, many species to describe because the mountains give way for increased diversity.
Yeah, and it's kind of neat that some of the new species that are in the field guide, there's one I think we called it Fee's mucksucker. It was a lot of fun coming up with the common names. And anyways, the larvae in this group, Orthonevra, are found in mud, and they live in mud feeding on bacteria and other things in the mud. So hence the name mucksuckers. Frank Fee was an amateur entomologist who collected heavily in the northeastern US, spent decades collecting in Pennsylvania and in a few sites really. And he had an incredible eye for finding flower flies, and really proves the value of collections because, all his material was donated to the Philadelphia collection, and we were able to go and look through it. And there are a number of things that were not found in any other collections or any other material. And so it was really valuable that he'd made those collections. We described it Orthonevra fei. We named it after Frank. And since then, it's really cool because things are changing, right? The collections are critical for understanding and elucidating taxonomy and relationships between species. But now we have more and more ways that people can contribute to citizen science. So iNaturalist being one, Bug Guide being another. And since we wrote the book and described this species, there are now records from Prince Edward Island and where else? I think Maine and Vermont. And so this was a species that was known from a single bog and is now known from 4 sites based on 3 new photographic records.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I mean, that's one of the great things about technology and the world we live in today is that we have all of these different ways to contribute, and getting those extra eyes on the ground and looking, and who knows what we're going to find out if everybody's just kind of looking and paying attention and sharing what we're finding. And yeah, I love that about places like iNaturalist and Bug Guide. And those are becoming such valuable resources for science and for homeowners or naturalists just interested in learning more. Because I mean, I know I use Bug Guide a lot to try and figure out what it is I'm seeing out there in the field, because I'm just now starting to get interested in the insects. And I mean, I've always been interested in the birds and the flowers and the mammals and these larger, more charismatic animals. And now within the past several years, I've just fallen into the world of the insects and really started loving those. So now I've got a whole new area to learn.
Yeah, and it's really nice timing that we were able to get this field guide out when we did. It was a long endeavor. It took us a decade to produce. And the reason it takes so long for a field guide of this type, it's the first comprehensive guide to any group of flies in North America. And making it comprehensive meant that we had to look at lots of collections, identify, thousands of specimens, work out, species concepts that hadn't been worked out since, 100 years ago, and then make it available in a format that was user-friendly and people could use. And right away, we're seeing, the uptake from the field guide with lots of new citizen science records. And this was always our goal. We were hoping that things that might be one or two dots on a map with no known ecology, we might know more about their natural history and find out much more about their distribution. Some of them will probably be at risk because they're very, very limited in distribution, whereas others have just been understudied. Perhaps this bog-dwelling one, for example, it might be much more widespread than we ever thought. It has quite a narrow flight window by the looks of it, 2 or 3 weeks maybe as an adult.
Oh, wow. So that makes it even harder to even know what you've got out there, because you've got such a short window to find it. But yeah, you said some of these may be at risk. Do we know if any of these are endangered or threatened, or do we just not have enough information to even know that at this point in time?
For a lot of species, we don't have enough information. There's quite a number where we just don't have enough specimens from enough locations to make that determination. Environment Canada, part of our government, went through quite a number of years ago now and did assessments on all the species in Canada, which I worked on with another colleague, Andrew Young, who is now teaching at the University of Guelph. And we went through and did all these assessments. We looked at all the material in our collection and some of the other collections across Canada, and even some of the collections in the States that had Canadian material. We used what we could find, and records from the literature and records from citizen science projects to try to figure it out. And I can't remember how many were considered at risk. Jeff, do you remember?
So there's probably only one that they will identify as at risk, and that's Aristillus brucei. It's, what do we call it? Hourglass dronefly, I think we called it. And that one was once widespread. There are records from the 1800s around our area down to Kentucky nearly. It was one of the most common flower flies according to the collection. And it's now found in only a few sites along the interface between the tundra and the forest in northern Canada, and then in some of the montane regions, high altitude montane regions in the west. So that one's probably declined because of an introduced Aristillus species. Aristillus arbistorum, which we called European dronefly. We don't know how that's happened, although we suspect it's not due to competitive displacement, but perhaps it's actually hybridization. So they're quite closely related. And it looks like the European ones just outcompeted the other one and hybridized it into the dust. But we were not sure about that. But that's the one that we're sure is in trouble. There are many that we think might be in trouble. I think, Michelle and Andrew and I looked at, I think we might have identified 25% of the species as being potentially at risk, but Environment Canada downgraded a lot of that to not having enough data. So they're pretty conservative about their approach. But I feel, we have enough data and enough people have been collecting them to see real declines in some of the species. And it looks like any species that are habitat specialists obviously tend to be the ones to get in trouble first. And in Europe in particular, we've seen a lot of the species that are old growth specialists. So we haven't talked about syrphid babies yet. I don't like calling them maggots, so they're babies. And so flower fly larvae do everything. There's only a few families of insects that have truly sort of capitalized on all the different life history possibilities. Probably the most diverse group of flies in terms of their life histories are Foridae. They're sometimes called scuttle flies or coffin flies because they're often found 6 feet under doing nasty things to corpses. So phorids are incredible. Every single life history you can imagine known to insects, that one family does. Flower flies are almost as diverse. So about a third of our species are predators of soft-bodied insects, mostly aphids, some scales, other things like that. So they're really beneficial in the environment, not just as pollinators, but they're taking out a lot of potential pests as well. But then there are others that are in rot holes, and they're bacterial filter feeders like the Orthonevra, the mucksuckers. They're filter feeding bacteria. Sometimes they're in wetlands like the Orthonevra. Other times they're in little container wetlands like rot holes in trees. And that tends to occur in old big trees, so old growth trees. And it's kind of cool. So in Europe, there's a really beautiful species called Blera phallax, which is black with an orange butt. We have a species here very similar to it, Blera annulus. Anyways, Blera phallax is a specialist in these cavities, rot holes in old growth pine trees. And they've disappeared from a lot of their range in Europe. And they're now actually making these specialized artificial habitats using chainsaws and making rot holes that these things can live in, and they're bouncing back. So they're managing for them. So it's kind of interesting. You know, people always think of big vertebrates as being the things that we're managing environments for, but really insects are phenomenal indicators because they occur on a more micro scale and give us more information on a micro scale about the health of the environment.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the babies, because that was something I wanted to talk about, was the different life histories involved with the flower flies, because I don't know much about flower flies. I really don't, other than it's very diverse. I mean, I always thought that they were just bee wasp mimics, but in preparing for this interview, I found out some mimic ants. So yeah, I really wanted to talk about what those different life histories are like, and what do the babies eat, and what do the adults eat, and where do you find them, and just all of these different things, because that's something I don't know. And I think many of our listeners would enjoy learning more about as well.
Yeah, so you mentioned the ones that mimic ants. So there's a group, the microdontines, or the ant flies, and their larvae look like little domes, and they've actually were described as several other things other than fly larvae. They were described as mollusks once, I believe.
5 times.
Oh, 5 times they were described as mollusks.
Oh, wow.
So people just didn't know what they were, but they're found in ant nests. And what they do is they don't look like an ant, but we believe that they can survive in ant nests because they actually produce similar chemicals to the ant brood, or to ants, and then that the ants just overlook them in the nest and just go about their business as these larvae go through, and they eat the ant larvae in these nests.
Very cool. Yeah, so it's more chemical mimicry than actual physical mimicry there.
Yeah, and there's been a little bit more done on that recently, and it looks like they're quite species specific, with different species of ant flies feeding in different ants. But there's still a lot to learn there. Only 8% of the ant flies worldwide have had their larvae described. And so I think that's a good indication of how little we know about flower fly larvae. So we're using the name ant flies for that group. So they're the sister group to the rest of the flower flies. So they're quite different. They have this weird larval life history. The adults don't typically go to flowers. So they really are quite different than the rest of the flower flies. So we've sort of given them their own name, the ant flies. But flower flies as a whole, we know surprisingly little about the larvae. You know, we know a few here and there, and a huge amount of the information we put in our book about larval life history comes from what we know about European species. And this is the great thing about the other aspect of life that we study. It's called phylogenetics. So we're really interested in how things are related to each other. And this comes back in the names that we give things. So we use that name Blera. We were talking about the endangered one in Europe, Blera phallax. So Blera is the genus. Phallax is the specific epithet. So together, Blera phallax is the species. And all of the Blera, if we're doing our job right, should be all related and have a single common ancestor. And in fact, they don't in that case. So we need to change it. So Somnula is another genus. So Blera are called wood flies, and Somnula are called wood flies as well. And the reason we called them the same common name is Somula is just a blera. And we now know that Somula is part of this genus Blera. They all share a single common ancestor. So at some point, we're going to write a paper to sync that name and get rid of the name Somula, which is a shame. It's a lovely name, Somula. But they're all wood flies and all have a single common ancestor. And knowing that, we can make predictions about them. So if we know something about a European Blera, like the one that lives in rot holes, we probably can assume that all of the related species, probably all of Blera, do the same thing. And so what we really need now, and we're really hoping this field guide instigates this, is get more people looking not just at adults, but also at larvae, and seeing if we can uncover some of the life histories of the North American flower flies that we don't know anything about yet.
Yeah, that's exciting. One of the things that has always attracted me to nature and science is just everything that we don't know and all the mysteries out there and things still to be discovered. So yeah, I like the fact that there's still questions and things that we can help learn about with that. But we keep talking about the different species, and the field guide is obviously there to help people figure out what they're looking at. So what are some of the ways that you would go about identifying a flower fly out in the field? I mean, I know sometimes with insects, you have to bring them in, put them under the microscope, look at the wing venation, look at genitalia, do all that stuff. But if somebody's just out looking in their garden, looking at the wildflowers or the trees or whatever in the field, and it's like, that's a flower fly. What is it? How would you go about distinguishing what it is, and how far can you typically get? Can you get down to species usually, or do you usually have to stop at the family or genus level?
So maybe we can start with, how do you identify a flower fly in the field?
Yeah.
The more you look and the more you learn, the easier it gets. And at a quick glance, I can say, oh, that's a flower fly, that's a bee. And people just look at me, like, how on earth, that's not a fly, what are you talking about? So I think some of the ways to identify flower flies in the field, so they tend to hover in flight, whereas if you look at a bee, they sort of amble a little more around. Like bumblebees are really good examples of that. If you watch a bumblebee fly, it just is kind of flies around, like it doesn't necessarily have a direct path, whereas flower flies, they hover in one spot and then they tend to move to another spot really quickly and stop. They'll move to a flower and stop for a while, and then they move directly. They're very good flyers. So part of the reason they're such good flyers is they have 2 wings, whereas bees have 4 wings. And flower flies, their second set of wings has been reduced to a different organ we call halteres, and they act as little gyroscopes to help them fly much more accurately. So if you can get a really good close look, you'll see distinctive 2 wings. The bees, their front and back wings kind of hook together, so it kind of looks like they have 2 wings, but you can see a front wing and then a small rear wing behind. Their head and antennae shape is another sort of good giveaway. So flower flies generally have, it's hard to describe the shape of the head, but once you see how the heads look, you can sort of start to pick that up. But the antennae of most flower flies is very short, so you can't really see that they have antennae, whereas bees have long elbowed antennae. So that's generally good, except there are some syrphids that they're such good mimics that they actually use their front legs to wave like they're mimicking antennae on a bee or a wasp. And there's a few syrphids that have slightly longer antennae to sort of help with that bee mimicry as well.
Yeah, I'm like you. I've got a pretty good, I mean, yours is going to be much better, search image for what a flower fly looks like versus a bee looks like. And yeah, that behavior, the flower flies dart and then they stop and they hover, and they dart and they stop and they hover, whereas the bees are more kind of, like you said, ambling. That's a good way. And then I used to say, oh yeah, look for the wings. And to me, I've got a pretty good image for what a bee wing looks like, with the 2 wings that are kind of Velcroed together to look like one versus a single fly wing. But everybody's like, I can't tell the difference, especially people who might be a little bit more timid around bees, or like I want to get that close. I'm like, well, look at the eyes. The flies have fly eyes. I mean, you look at a housefly, you know what a fly eye looks like. The hoverflies, flower flies, they have the fly eyes. Bees don't have fly eyes.
Yeah.
And so that usually seems to help more. And I always forget about the antennae. So thanks for bringing that up and pointing that out again.
Yeah. And with flower flies, with their eyes, like you point out, many species, not all, but many, the males have much bigger eyes than the females, and their eyes actually touch in the center, whereas that doesn't happen at all in bees. So if you see these big eyes that come together in the middle that are touching, that's also helpful, and that would be a male flower fly. But yes, not all males have those touching eyes.
But they're still bigger than a bee eye to me. I mean, even drone bees, the male bees have bigger eyes than the females, but they just don't look like fly eyes. I don't know. There's something different. I think everybody gets their own little search image, but once you get it, you get it.
Exactly.
Yeah, so these things generally work, and we've developed a good eye for it, obviously. And the idea of mimicry is that it's probably mostly vertebrate predators that are the big driver on the evolution of mimicry in this group. And so it turns out that a study that was done at Carleton University a few years back looked at mimicry and the question about what's the driver between perfect mimicry and imperfect mimicry, because you'll notice when you start to study flower flies that some of them look almost exactly like the bees or wasps that they're modeling, whereas others are just kind of like general yellow, black, bee-ish, waspish things, but not really. So those are what we call imperfect mimics. And anyways, this study found that it was size. So the bigger the flower fly, the more pressure to be a perfect mimic. And that's probably simply because vertebrate predators, birds probably for the most part, if they see a very large piece of food, they're going to scrutinize it carefully and go for it. And so you have to be a better mimic than the little ones, kind of like, oh, is that a bee or wasp? Don't take a second look. It's not worth the extra time because it's small. So that may be the driver behind it. But some are so good that even though we spend a huge amount of time in the field looking at these, there are some that we often overlook. So there's one group called the Wasp Flies. We call them Wasp Flies because they're such good mimics. And they have narrow abdomens. They look a lot like mini wasps. And as Michelle said, the antennae on most flies and most syrphids is very much fixed. So there must be some huge evolutionary constraint on antennal shape. And they all are about the same, with a few exceptions. And in this group, it's really neat that some of them, to get around the problem of short antennae, if you're a perfect mimic, that's not going to work, right? Mm-hmm. So they actually have a stalk that's grown out of the front of their head, and the antennae are on the stalk. So still short antennae, but on a stalk makes it look long. And then Michelle mentioned some that wave their front legs in front of their face. So that's behavioral mimicry that appears to be antennae when they're sitting there. There's a genus called Temnostoma that they do that a lot. But there are some that have actually managed to grow longer antennae. And one of the Cryorina species, Williston's wasp fly, it's actually, it has long antennae. And those can be really, really tricky to tell in the field. And I often find I'm either overlooking them or I'll just net wasps a lot of the time when they fly by, just because I'm not sure. And so there's even behavioral mimicry in the flight styles. So although the flight style is often indicative that you have a flower fly because they're hovering and whatnot, not all of them do that. Some are really excellent mimics of the flight style of wasps as well.
Oh, wow. I know I've been overlooking stuff then with that because, yeah, my favorite are the little bitty yellow and black flat ones that just, they look like a little bee if you're not paying any attention. But once you start actually paying attention, yeah, it's obviously not a bee. Yeah, those are the easy ones. Those are the ones I feel most comfortable on. But yeah, there's a lot that some of those more perfect mimics that I know I'm overlooking. And then listening to you, it's like, I know I'm overlooking even more than I thought I was.
The trick is that once you recognize that it's a fly, the perfect mimics are easy to ID to species because usually there's only one that looks like one model. So those are the ones that are just super, super easy once you get to learn them. And so you ask sort of, how do you get beyond knowing that it's a flower fly to the species level? And in the field guide, we've got little symbols for different things. And so we've got an eyeball that shows that this is field identifiable. You should be able to identify it in the field with some experience. You're not going to know it right away. You're not going to learn these things immediately, but with experience, that works. Others, we show a hand lens with the suggestion that you're probably going to have to collect it or catch it, look at it with a hand lens, and you can then release it if you wish. Others show a microscope. The microscope ones you're going to have to bring home. You're going to probably have to kill them, pin them, look at them through a microscope. Fortunately, there were not many that we felt fell into that category. So I think out of 413 or 14, we only had maybe a couple dozen that fell into that category. So most of them can be field identified, even if you need a hand lens. I would say probably, I've not sat down and done this. I don't know if you have, Michelle, but about half of them maybe field identifiable even without a hand lens, 40% perhaps. But it's like anything. And this is something, a little commentary on our times perhaps. When I was a kid growing up, I started learning insects first. That was my first passion. But there were no field guides. There was Peterson Guide to Insects, which taught you the families with black and white illustrations. And that was it. And so I very quickly became frustrated because I couldn't learn anything. Because, of course, knowing the name is the key to accessing other information, right? So that's why we name things. It's a way to organize information. And so I started looking at birds. But even birds, you had to take your field guide, you'd sit down, and every night I would flip through. And it's like, was that a sparrow? Was it a finch? Was it a warbler? And after time, you start to recognize, okay, that's a finch shape. That's a sparrow shape. The bills are different, that sort of thing. And it takes a lot of time. And in this day and age, I just find a lot of people aren't willing to put that kind of time into things and expect instant gratification and identification. So it's like, take a picture, run it through an identification engine on iNaturalist and give me the name. Well, that's great when it works. And for birds, those ID engines are fantastic. For plants, they're unbelievably good. For flower flies, they're not yet fantastic, although they're getting better. Already 1 year after the field guide, those ID engines that you can use on apps like iNaturalist are 100 times better than they were a year ago. And that's because more people are putting more identified things in, and the engine becomes better. It's using artificial intelligence to learn. So I guess the way that I would approach learning a group like this in the new age is, if you have a camera or even your phone, is get a picture, use an ID engine on iNaturalist or something, and that might hopefully will get you to genus. And then use the field guide to try to narrow it down to species. Or if the thing gives you a species name, check in the field guide and see, rather than blindly saying, okay, it must be that, because the ID engine's only as good as the data that support it, right? So it's interesting. If I was learning this, I would still spend a lot of time flipping through the field guide, page to page, learning the different groups and gestalts and colors. But not everybody has the time for that or the interest in doing that. So use it as a check, I guess, as an option.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it too. I'm like you. I grew up with the field guides. I still go to the field guides. iNaturalist is starting to become more and more interesting to me as an ID method, just because you get tired of lugging around pounds of books with you in the fields. And I always was that person. I would have 10 pounds of books in my backpack because I wanted to have the bird guide and the plant guide. And even though I knew most of them, I may run into something I don't know. So I've got to be able to look it up. And then, of course, as my interest grew, because I've never been able to specialize in one thing, I like everything. And so then now I have the butterfly guides and so suddenly you can't carry everything. So it is interesting to do it that way. But yeah, I'm the person that'll be flipping through the field guide and learning them that way too, trying to get at least an idea of where to start at.
Yeah, and I just put in one more thing just to finish that thread off, is that I think that the field guides are the best way to start learning a group. I have apps for everything I can on my phone, and I have the field guide on my phone as well, right? So, but the problem with most apps is you kind of need to know where to start if you're using a computer app. And that's where iNaturalist can help, right? Is it might throw you into the right part of the book. But really, for me, still, learning a new group, flipping through a field guide is the way to really become familiar with the group as a whole, because it shows you not only what the species you're interested in today is, but it shows you what the others around it are like, how they might be related to each other, what they do for a living. And it just gives you context and allows you to build that whole picture of the group, which I think is hard to do using an app-based approach or an artificial identification approach.
Yeah, I think that's my biggest thing against using them for that, is because I'm the person that doesn't just want to be told the answer all the time. I want to know why that's the answer so that next time I can figure out what it is myself, or go, okay, that's not that one, but it's got to be related to that one because of this and be able to start having some of that knowledge for myself?
When we set up the guide, we grouped it so that all the bumblebee mimics were together and all the wasp mimics were together and all the little black ones that don't really look like bees are together. So that's a good way to start learning which groups are out there and which ones, you see one that is a bumblebee, well, which groups could it be? And they're all close together so that when you flip through the book, you can see, oh, I found the spot where the bumblebees are. And then you can sort of flip through and see, okay, these few genera have bumblebee mimics. So what are the differences between these groups? And so that's a really helpful way rather than organizing it taxonomically and having to flip back and forth and things like that. So yeah, it's laid out in a really sort of helpful manner that makes flipping through to find what you're looking for pretty straightforward.
I love that. That's going to be awesome. I'm looking forward to it starting to become spring here and things to warm up. So I know the flower flies are going to be out before too much longer. At least the little bitty yellow and black ones will be out. And so I'm looking forward to really starting to learn a little bit more about which ones they are and putting the field guide to use. But kind of going off of that, where do you usually find flower flies and what kind of weather conditions and stuff should we be looking at them in?
I think a lot of them are active earlier in the season. You can find flower flies from early spring to late fall, but as the season goes on, the diversity kind of tapers off. I find in the summer, we're left with a lot more of the agricultural ones hanging around. Some of the like Aristolis are still around, but the real diversity comes in the spring with all the flowers. When the trees flower, when all the like bushes and the early spring flowers, that you get a lot of diversity of flower flies. So I would start early, start on nice days, when it's 15 degrees Celsius out and sunny, there's not much wind, go outside and look around. You want to look on flowers, but on cooler days, you also want to look on low vegetation that's in the sun. They like to sun themselves. So sometimes even just along a path, the low vegetation that's there, like a path in the woods, if there's some sun coming in, they might be sitting on the vegetation in sunny spots. But mainly you want to look at flowers, look at trees when they're flowering, like cherry trees and things like that. Sometimes they like white flowers and like big flat, like umbellifer type flowers. Yeah, I mean, pretty much anywhere. You have some species that don't come to flowers, so they might be sitting on freshly cut logs or freshly fallen trees are a good place to look for some of those species.
If you're out really early in the spring, one of the first flowers, I think, throughout your listening area is probably dandelion. It's an introduced, common dandelion European species. And it's a very, very good nectar source. And so a lot of early spring pollinators will be going to that. So early spring flower flies, early spring bee flies, which are another cool group, and early spring bees will all be at that. And like Michelle said, don't forget to look on trees. Often there's some fairly inconspicuous flowers or flowers we don't think of or look for, and there will be flower flies on those. One of the really common early spring ones are the willows. And willows are fantastic for attracting flower flies. So you'll sort of learn which types of flowers are better for flies and better for bees. So if it's long and tubular, chances are that's not flower flies, but there are exceptions. So there's a group, Thuringia, have long snouts, and inside that snout is a very complicated proboscis that sticks out a long ways, and they can get the snout and proboscis down into deep tubular flowers. So that's just one example. Another example is Cryorina. I think we called them the cold noses, did we?
Yeah.
Cryorina are an early spring perfect mimic of bumblebees, and you'll see them on willows. But some of your listeners out west will see them on different flowers. In the mountains, you'll see these little bell-like tubular flowers, and the cryorines are specialists on those. So yeah, it's not always flat top flowers. So you have to, if you want to see the full diversity, you have to look everywhere and think like a fly.
That's interesting. I have to learn more about flies before I can think like a fly, but that's the fun part. There's more to learn. And one of the points that I wanted to make sure we came back to, and we've alluded to it several times, but I wanted to really bring it out and talk about it a little bit more. You said that not all of the flower flies go to flowers, and that sometimes you might find them in other locations. Where else might we find them, and what are they doing if they're not coming to flowers?
So I think we've talked about several that are found on trees. So there's certain groups that are attracted to freshly fallen trees. So when they can pick up the scent of trees that have just come over, their larvae will live in that wood. So you can look for freshly fallen trees. There's also ones that the larvae breed in sap runs in trees. So you can look on tree trunks where you see sap running, or where if you see any big rot holes in trees, you can look around the edges and look for the adults in there. And then again, along vegetation in the sun. So if you're walking through the woods and you come across a patch where there's vegetation and there's a sunny spot, especially on cooler days, you might find them just sitting on the vegetation, sunning themselves.
So those species that are feeding as larvae in rot holes and sap runs and things like that, as Michelle said, they're often easiest to find in that habitat. But of course, it can be very hard to find an appropriate sap run or rot hole. And, you might only find one in a season of out, hunting, or a few. And so still those flies, most of them will go to flowers. But if they're deep wood species, the flowers might be up at the tops of the trees. And so it can be quite tricky to find them. And they can be distributed very unevenly. So you might find one tree that's in flower that everything's at. And so again, and that's what Frank Fee did. He would go back to the same tree year after year and increase his knowledge in his collection doing that. Another way that, we keep finding new ways to collect these, and some colleagues in Africa, they were working on these sap run species, which tend to be really, really rare in nature and distributed very unevenly. And they found that the best way to collect those was along little streams in the forest. They would take water and throw it up onto the bank, onto the sand or the mud, and sit and watch. So you have to be incredibly patient. And they were able to collect large series of previously unknown species, undescribed species, and many specimens by doing that. But, we're talking like 1 an hour sort of thing often. But with great patience, you can sort of find these things. So yeah, the ones that are either at arboreal flowers that are up high or on these habitats Michelle described can be really tricky to find.
Okay. But all adult flower flies feed on nectar. It's not like with butterflies. We always think of them as being on flowers, but we have butterflies that almost never go to flowers. They're feeding more on sap or something like that. But is it like that with flower flies, or are they just all nectar feeders?
No, that's true of flower flies as well. So I would say almost all are nectar feeders, but many will use other sources of food. So one of the things is honeydew. So when there's aphids or scale up in the trees feeding, they're excreting a lot of sugar-rich droppings, and many insects, including some flower flies, will feed on that. And others will go to sap runs. There's one species of Cryorina that we think probably almost exclusively feeds on sap runs. It's an extremely early spring species. It's extremely rare from what we can tell. It's found probably in February in the Washington, D.C. area to maybe March down in your area in Kentucky. And we think that it's only on sap runs.
Interesting.
We've also got some that feed on things like pollen. So you might not, you'll see them at flowers, but there's a species called the Maize Calligrapher. So it's a toxomerus. There's 2 species that we really commonly see in the Northeast, but the Maize Calligrapher is called that because it feeds on corn pollen. So, it won't be at your conventional flower. And there's some that feed the sedge sitters, they feed on grass pollen sometimes. So there's some sort of unconventional places where you might find them, not on your big showy garden flowers, but on the little flowers and pollen sources that we don't really think of.
Yeah, so just to add the name of that one Cryorina that's only on sap, because if people want to try to help, this would be a really fun one, to get out right now and look for. We called it winter bumbleflies. So the Cryorinas, I thought we called them cold noses, but no, we called them bumbleflies because they look like bumblebees, most of them. But this one doesn't look like a bumblebee. It has very strange antennae, and it's just a very bizarre thing. And it was in another genus, and we've only recently put it in Cryorina. So the winter bumblefly, but that would be a great one to look for if you're out walking. It seems to like ravines, and I don't think it's a ravine specialist. I think what it is I think it's an old growth specialist. And often that habitat that remains is in ravines.
Well, with some of these tree sap ones like that, I know for moths, you can make a concoction and smear it on the tree trunk to get the moths to come and be able to more easily identify and observe them. Is that a technique that works for flower flies as well, or has it not been tried?
Not been tried to my knowledge. Give it a go. Let us know.
But you can mimic honeydew. So you can make a honey spray using things like honey, Coca-Cola. I don't know how many people are using urine and rotting fish and things like those really smelly things. But sometimes you can spray that on vegetation. If it's rained recently and all the honeydew is washed away, you can spray a concoction of honeydew spray, and it sometimes will attract syrphids and other flies or sometimes even bees that feed on that sugary substance.
But I really like your idea of using the mixture we'd use for Catocala moths, the underwing moths, which is molasses and beer and brown sugar mixed together, and painted on the trunks of trees in these old growth ravines looking for winter bumbleflies. It's a great idea. It'd be worth trying.
Yeah, it was just one of those things as you were talking, it seemed like there might be similarities there for at least the food source. And if the food source is the same, then maybe the attraction method might help to get them down where we can see them versus way up in the tree trunks.
Could be. So you'll sometimes find lots and lots of flower flies in one area. And what it is they use a landmark mating system, some of them. So the most common is hilltopping. And in the field guide, we have a little mountainous symbol beside all the species that we know hilltop. And so not all of them do it, but many, many do. And we're pretty sure that it's not an obligatory behavior. So what happens is, imagine if you're a little insect and you need to find a mate. If you're a plant feeder, that's not so bad, right? You go to the plant and you look for your mate there. But there's only a few plant feeding flower flies. There's some bulb feeders, some plant feeders. The group we call the blacklets, Chilosea, those are all plant feeders. But for the most part, they're not plant feeding. So how do they find each other? So they go to landmarks, and that can be, like Michelle said, a bush in the sun that's prominent. It can be a dead tree out in the field that's prominent, something that stands out, but it's often hilltops. And so this hilltopping is a really fantastic phenomena. It's really, really fun to see. So if any of your listeners are ever finding themselves on a mountaintop or a hilltop looking at the vista and you notice a lot of buzzing, take a careful look around you, and they're probably mostly flies and mostly males. So what happens, the males go up onto these landmark situations like a hilltop, and they'll pick a spot. So some of them will sit on trunks of trees, some will sit on leaves, some will sit on the ground, some hover, and each species has its own behavior on the hilltop. And they just stay there for hours at a time. And if a female wants to mate, she'll come up, find a male, and mate with them. And so you rarely see the females because they're just transients. They just come up, grab a male, and disappear. So it's the males that are hanging around there. It's a really great way to start to get a handle on what flower flies are in an area. For the heck of it, I counted up how many flower flies we've seen and collected on Mount Rigaud. So there's this really prominent hilltop near where we live in Ottawa. It's about an hour and a half from here, just inside Quebec. And these don't have to be monster hills. This is just it's an isolated hill that's not near any others. We've collected 114 species of flower flies on that one hilltop. And that's most of the species that are in our area. We certainly wouldn't have over 200. I've never sat down and added it up, but a good chunk can be surveyed by looking at a hilltop. And the really rare ones, the ones that we see the least, are most prevalent hilltoppers because they simply can't find each other otherwise because they're so distributed rarely, and unevenly in nature. So it's a great place to see some of the really cool syrphids that are less common.
Nice. Yeah, I'm going to have to go check out some hilltops because that does sound like a very good way to find it. And it makes sense why they would be doing that too, especially the rarer ones, because like you said, if they're rare, it's hard for them to find each other versus just us trying to find them.
So they're not actually up there for resources, I should add that. So usually they're just doing the hilltopping behavior. And if there's flowers, that's great. You might find some going to the flowers up there, but usually they're just focused on hilltopping and their mating behavior. And the whole thing, it's a morning activity. That's another thing to point out. It starts often very early, as soon as it's just warm enough. So 60 degrees, what is that, 15-ish. You start to see activity on the hilltop, and activity will peak before noon and start to drop off by 2 p.m. And then after that, there's very, very little going on up there. So if you're not an early riser, you're going to miss that.
Based on the temperatures you gave, I'm going to guess that's more of a mid-season activity than an early season activity, because I mean, in the early spring here, like late February, early March down here in Kentucky, it may not hit 60 until after lunch, until that afternoon period. We're more into mid 50s or so for the mornings. And sometimes that's just our high.
Think about it from an insect's perspective. So it might be 60 where your face is, but down near the rocks, it's probably warmer. And as long as there's not much wind, you can have activity on a hilltop when it's much cooler than that. But also the very early spring taxa are more tolerant of cold. So the things that we would see flying in April, you might see flying in March in Kentucky. Mm-hmm. Those things are able to fly at colder temperatures, at lower temperatures. So one of the really cool ones is Calycera. It has long antennae. It's a good mimic. And they're very early spring April flyers. And so they've been kind of overlooked. We thought they might be an at-risk group, but we've been doing more trapping and looking, and they're probably a little more common than we realized, but they're an early spring thing.
And how long do the larvae live, and how long do they live as an adult?
So most flower flies, their whole lifespan is probably about a year. So they go from egg to larvae to pupa to adults. A lot of them spend much more time as a larvae than they do as an adult. Even though the adults are what we know the best, they're what we see the most, they're more charismatic, they probably spend a much more significant portion of their lifetime as larvae. So for the ant flies, for example, the microdons, we think that the adults are only active for about 2 to 3 weeks a year. And so there's a really short flight window, along with many other species, that we have to actually collect and find these species. And that's probably why some of them are so poorly represented in collections. It's just we're not out collecting at the right time in the right spot to collect these things. So yeah, they'll spend most of their development as larvae. A lot of the surfines that feed on aphids, the adults will be out early in the season and they lay the eggs. And then the late season is larvae, and they're growing and they're feeding on bacteria, feeding on aphids, feeding on whatever it is that these syrphids are feeding on. And then they overwinter typically as either the third instar larvae. So the larvae, they have instars and they get bigger and bigger. So the last instar larvae, or as a pupa in the leaf litter and things like that. And they overwinter and then they emerge. I don't know if there's many that are known to overwinter as adults, but so they're pretty much developed and ready to become an adult and ready to start flying when the spring comes. So then they either pupate or they just emerge from the pupa after winter. Or if it is an adult that has overwintered, it just becomes active in the spring. And then they feed on nectar, they gain energy, they mate, they lay eggs, and then the larvae continue the cycle and develop. There are some species that we know that are called multivoltine. So univoltine is one brood a year. Multivoltine are multiple. And so we tend to find, especially the stuff in agricultural fields, where their fields are going, there's aphids for long periods of time. There's plenty of food resources, and they will sometimes have multiple broods, with broods in the late summer as well.
Yeah, that was another question I had, was how many generations do they tend to be? So typically one, but there's always exceptions.
The ones that you will become most familiar with in your gardens are multivoltine, typically. So the calligraphers, Toxomerus, that genus, they're the little ones you were talking about. They're cute little flies that are really common in people's gardens. And there's 2 or 3 species that are likely to dominate. And they occur from early spring through late fall. And that's because they have multiple generations. So it's not one individual you're seeing in your garden. It's just a constant changeover every week or 2 with new individuals. The ones that overwinter that Michelle was mentioning, those are the first ones that you see at your dandelions. So the first things that appear at dandelions in the spring are often things that overwintered. Holophilus, the marsh flies, Aristolus tenax, one of the drone flies, the European drone fly, are introduced. Common dronefly, I think we called it. They're often overwintering. Those are overwintering as adults, and they're the first ones we see. Now, that's not always the case. The first surface are out very, very early, but they probably overwinter as a pupa, and they just pop when the day length and heat units are appropriate.
And when we're seeing them really late in the season, so I found one Thanksgiving-ish that was on a dandelion. It was just one of the little yellow and black ones. Was that one that was typically probably going to be overwintering, or was it just a late adult?
Probably a late adult if it's a yellow and black one. So Holophilus and Aristilus are the ones that are going to overwinter. And you could see them any month. So if you have a warm day in the winter and you've got some dandelions, you may see them come out for a quick feed. But yeah, that was probably a late one. Now there's another factor that comes into it too. There are some migratory flower flies. And so we're just starting to barely get a handle on this. This is all fairly new for us here in North America. In Europe, they've studied it a little more. And so there's 2 or 3 species that are really strongly migratory in Europe, and literally millions can be seen massing and then leaving Great Britain, heading across to the mainland in the fall and then reversing in the spring. And here I've seen several species that I'm pretty sure are migrating, and a lot of the yellow and black ones. So Allegrapta, Eupiodes, Surface. I think there are many of the species that migrate. And we haven't got a clue if it's like monarchs where they go south and then different generation comes back, presumably, likely. And then they sort of hop their way north, whether there are some that overwinter here and others come back in, or whether they're entirely reliant on migrants to replenish northern populations. We just don't know all those questions yet, the answers to those questions. But that's something that anyone that's listening could help us uncover information on that. Look for patterns of early spring and late fall flower flies. See if you see concentrations and try to figure out if they're migrating. I was along the northern Lake Erie shoreline in last September, and there was a massive migration of wasps going on. There was a cold front came in, and during the day, the wind shifted from south to north. And these wasps called Encystra circus, there had been tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, everywhere I looked on goldenrod and other flowers. And with the north wind, they suddenly picked up, and they were all flying in mass in the same direction along the lakeshore. And just like birds, they're heading along the lakeshore until they find a narrow spot where they can cross the lake. And that behavior had never been documented in that genus before. They were totally not known to be migratory. And it's the same with flower flies. Like, watch for that kind of behavior. Document it, write it up. You'll be the first one to discover it, very likely.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I'd forgotten about migratory flower flies. The first time I was introduced to it, this concept was maybe a year ago. There was an article in the magazine 2 Million Blossoms that talked about it. And 2 Million Blossoms is a newer magazine focused on pollinators. The editor, Kirsten Trainer, was actually one of my first guests on this podcast. But yeah, it was a fascinating article on it because I never really thought about flower flies migrating, but this was just on the eastern coast. And I hadn't really even thought about them being like possibly monarchs or any other insect like that might migrate, but would potentially come across the continent and more inland like I am, rather than just going on the mountains or down by the coastline.
There's also a post-breeding dispersal that you see. It's very common in some birds like flycatchers and herons, where after the nesting season, instead of migrating south, they'll just go everywhere, and they go north, east, west, whatever. And so you end up with these vagrant herons scattered around the periphery of their range, and flycatchers. I think the same thing's happening with flower flies. We don't know enough yet, but one genus, for example, Palpata, there are southern species that pop up way too far north in their distribution. So you get them up as far as Washington, D.C. and places like that in the late season. And so are these things vagrants that are doing some kind of post-breeding dispersal, or are they colonizing or attempting to colonize further north? It's hard to know at this point, but I suspect they're post-breeding vagrants. It's kind of cool. Yeah. A couple more things that we should probably talk about. One is just a very quick note on the field guide, is that the field guide covers everything from Kentucky, sort of west of the Mississippi and north, all the way up to northern Canada, even Greenland we included. So it's a big area that it covers. But even if you're outside of that field guide area, so in the southeast, say Tennessee, you're going to have almost all the species represented in the field guide. And even Florida, where things get a little bit hairy and there's lots of new species that we don't cover, you're still going to have most of them in the field guide. And we hope to do field guides for other regions, but it is a big undertaking, takes a lot of time. In the West, you might think that it's not very relevant, but we include full distribution maps for each species, so you can see which ones occur in the West as well. And so we've had people that have been telling us, well, please give us a Western guide, but in the meantime, we're enjoying yours. So yeah, so hopefully it works well outside of the primary Northeastern coverage, and people will find it useful across the US and Canada.
Yeah, I'm sure it will. Yeah. And seeing the maps, I was seeing how you do, like you said, had that full distribution. So it's going to be relevant to a point outside of the main area that you've got it in.
Yeah, and we have online resources. So we have a spreadsheet online that shows which states different species are in. And so, if you use the field guide and you identify something that looks like it might be right, you can check that online resource and find out, there's 2 other species in that genus that aren't in the field guide. Maybe it's one of those. So, you might have it, but you might not. So anyway, someday, hopefully, we'll have coverage for everywhere. But, it's all coming. There are field guides available in Europe in different places now. There's a really good guide for the Netherlands that covers all of the species there. There's a guide for Great Britain that covers that. And there are not really field guides, but hard copy sort of things that you'd use at home that cover all of Europe, or at least Northern Europe. So it's getting there. It's becoming a more and more accessible group. Love to do one for Australia as well, because we're starting to get a good handle on the fauna there as well.
Do you have anything else that you want to add before we wrap this up?
I would like to talk a little bit about attracting flower flies to your garden before we finish. I think that one of the great changes that we're seeing where we live in Ottawa, and maybe in most cities, is a lot of people are starting to move towards naturalized gardening. And it's exciting. It's great for biodiversity in general. And I think that the key take-home message is to plant native species as much as possible. So rather than getting ornamentals and planting them and then, wondering why they get hammered by introduced pests or native pests for that matter. If you plant native, you're not going to have those problems. So my garden, we plant only native things or near natives, things that are in the basic vicinity. And we don't have to water because they're all pre-adapted to the soil conditions that we're planting on, because we're planting things that were on sand. So we're planting things that grow well on sand. So no watering necessary, no fertilizer necessary. And when the insects are eating them, it's incredible that it doesn't decimate things. The plants, if a flower head gets eaten, then 5 flower heads come up from that point. It's just, it's incredible. It's not like trying to grow roses and pulling your hair out because the aphids are eating them all. And also having this native garden, try to think about planting a variety of heights of things. So you're planting shrubs as well as flowers. So the flowers are a great food source, but you need to have the food plants and the hiding places and everything else as well, right? So try to make a very natural looking yard, and you're going to get a lot of flower flies coming. You're going to get a lot of really cool insects coming, and you get a lot of natural controls from having all these things. I'll get little aphid outbreaks in my yard on certain plants, and the flower flies lay eggs in amongst them, and within no time, they're gone. So we always think of ladybird beetles as being major aphid predators. Well, flower flies as well, huge aphid predators. So yeah, I think that's the real trick. Find out what plants, so this is all part of being a naturalist, right? Find out what plants grow well in your area, invest in some books on native plants, and then hopefully you'll have a garden center nearby that specializes in native plants. If not, you can grow seeds, but it's a little bit more effort, but it's a lot of fun. It's rewarding. Everything I've grown in my property pretty much has been from seed, and it's slower, but it's cool because everything you've planted, you've sort of cultured yourself.
Yes, exactly. And another great thing about the world we live in today, like you said, it's becoming much more common and popular to plant natives and to have these pollinator gardens or these natural ecosystems that we're trying to create in our built landscapes. And I talk about this a lot in my blog. We're going to be having lots and lots of other episodes coming up where we're going to be talking about this as well. I mean, it's a common thread, and there's lots of resources out there available now. So no matter where you live, you're probably going to have a pretty good chance of finding some resource that's local to you that can help you figure out the best things to plant in your area for your species that are there.
Yeah, and of course there are non-natives that are good floral sources as well. Like we mentioned dandelions, and a lot of people have a war on dandelions. They're fantastic nectar sources in the shoulder seasons, early spring, late fall. And I certainly don't discourage them. They're fine. So I'm not 100% about making sure I've got all native plants. I don't mind having some things like that popping up here and there. Another thing, of course, that's really important is not to spray insecticides. Of course, if you want a naturalized garden, the last thing you want to do is spray insecticides in your property. And it takes a little time, right? Because if you've messed up the balance by spraying insecticides previously, you're going to have 2 or 3 years as you're naturalizing where you're going to have pest outbreaks. But after maybe 3 years or so, you're going to find that things take care of themselves. My parents went through this back when I was a kid, and it took us about 3 years, and we didn't have any more pest outbreaks by focusing on native. But again, you can still have a garden. It can still be manicured, and it still can look like a garden, but instead of planting things from Asia or Australia or whatever, you plant things that are local. And it's really fantastic, and it extends our natural corridors. So, instead of having these little postage stamp parks scattered here and there, suddenly we're connecting them by all of us looking after nature and planting native plants.
Exactly. That's one of the things I talk about a lot is if everybody does a little bit, then all of a sudden it makes a huge difference. And I know Doug Tallamy, that's really what he talks about in a lot of his work. And a lot more people and a lot more groups are starting to really focus in on that same sort of concept and idea.
I think I just want to say is just get out and explore and keep looking. Last summer when I was out, with the pandemic happening, I stayed a lot closer to home and spent a lot of time going for hikes since I couldn't go and hang out with friends. And, one time I came across a clearing in a forest and it was full of oregano, and it was just hopping with syrphids and clearwing moths and things like that. I think Jeff and I went back 2 weeks later and it was almost all the flowering was almost over, and there was many fewer specimens there. And so, things are short. So the more you get out and the more you observe, the more things you might see, and try to document those with pictures and putting records into iNaturalist or putting your photos on Bug Guide. We are constantly checking there for, the species that we don't know much about or the species that are commonly uncollected. We're constantly checking those sites for records and trying to find out more. So all of the data you get by exploring and by adding your sightings to these citizen science sites is helping science in a big way, because we don't have the resources to get out to all of your little corners to be exploring. So I think it's really, really important and really a lot of fun to do. And, if we're going into this spring where, there's still the need to socially distance from each other, that getting outside and exploring is a great activity to do by yourself or with, with your family.
Yeah, that's great. And I so agree with everything you just said. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating. I've so enjoyed it and learned so much about it, and really looking forward to getting out there and starting to find lots of new fun things and starting to identify them. And I will have a link in the show notes to your book so that if people are interested in it, they can go and look. You also sent me some links to other resources that you thought would be helpful for our listeners. So I'll make sure that those are available as well and easy to find. Thank you so much for talking with me today. And this has been wonderful. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
Thanks,
Shannon. Nice meeting you.
I am very grateful for Jeff and Michelle taking time out of their busy schedules to talk with us about flower flies. So often we overlook flies and other non-bee and non-butterfly pollinators, but they can be very important. I learned a lot from our conversation, and I was amazed at how diverse the flower flies are. I think it is also important to recognize how much we still don't know about flower flies, their larvae, or even their population distributions. And I think it is equally important to recognize how much individuals, just like you and me, have contributed to the flower fly knowledge base, and how much we can continue to contribute just by being interested in nature and documenting what we see. Before I wrap this up, I want to ask you to please tell someone else about this podcast. Word of mouth is really the fastest way for a podcast to grow. So your help in letting others know about the Backyard Ecology podcast is greatly appreciated. Until next week, I encourage you to take some time to enjoy the nature in your own yards and community.